Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming December of 2017 premiere auction. And specifically today we are looking at semi-automatic Uzi carbines, specifically Action Arms semi-automatic Uzi carbines, kind of a specific subject for today's video. Now, we will leave the actual development of the Uzi to another series of videos. Hopefully at some point I will be able to visit IMI in Israel and take a look at some of the developmental prototypes, and then we can really dig into that story. Today, we're going to pick up the story basically when it comes to the United States. So the Uzi was first adopted by the Israeli military in 1954, first used in the Suez in 1956, and didn't really garner very much interest in the United States. Now, as the Vietnam War started to heat up, the CIA was actually looking for submachine guns that were a little more modern and perhaps a little less distinctly American than Thompson's and grease guns that the US military used. And so they started importing a couple of different types of submachine guns for use in Southeast Asia. They used Swedish Ks, they used 1950 Madsen submachine guns, and they started to use a small number of Uzis. In total, about 3,000 Uzis would be imported by the CIA for covert military use. And these came in actually through Browning. So IMI manufactured Uzis in Israel, of course, and they had actually contracted a license for manufacture to the FN company in Belgium, because there were a number of European militaries that adopted the Uzi as a standard submachine gun and wanted them manufactured in Europe. Now, FN has this very long-standing relationship with the Browning company, and as a general rule, FN products in the United States are distributed by Browning. So the Uzis the full-auto Uzi submachine guns that were coming into the US were being imported through Browning. And that was pretty much it for Uzis in the US. There wasn't any formal distribution structure, there wasn't a major specific importer. There just wasn't that much knowledge or awareness or interest in the Uzi in the US. Now, the Secret Service would start to look at these guns because they were also interested in a more modern submachine gun than was currently in production in the US. And in 1968, the Secret Service would actually adopt the Uzi. We'll come back to Secret Service use in a little while. But even then, what you're looking at is kind of this mishmash of occasional imports. The Secret Service didn't buy a lot of the guns. They didn't need a lot. And there was no semi-automatic version of the gun. Now, in 1976, Uzi Gal, the gun's original designer, ended up moving to Philadelphia in the United States. He had family with some medical problems, and his military career wasn't progressing quite as quickly as he had wanted it to. He wasn't sure that there was a whole lot of continuing opportunity for him in Israel at that point. So, in order to move to the US, he had to get an H-1B visa, and he had to find employment in the US. And what he ended up being hired by a company called Action Manufacturing, owned by a man named Harry Stern, who was a Jewish-American businessman and ran this really pretty large company doing military manufacturing. He did fuses, explosives-related work. He had something like 1,000 employees in a 230-acre manufacturing complex, and did business with a lot of governments worldwide, including the Israeli government. So here's where we're getting various pieces of the story coming together here. Action Manufacturing hires Uzi Gal. Uzi actually originally does work developing a 30 caliber military rifle that can also be converted to 22 caliber using sabot cartridges. Really an interesting thing, but it didn't end up going anywhere. And in 1978, Harry Stern gets this idea that, well, maybe there'd be interest in a semi-automatic Uzi submachine gun in the US. He thinks it's a pretty cool idea. So he takes it to Uzi Gal, and Uzi doesn't think it's a great idea. Uzi doesn't see that there'd be any interest, any practical use for an Uzi on the commercial market in the US. It's a combat submachine gun. Well, Stern is not dissuaded, and he puts together a prototype. Well, he goes directly to IMI, the Israeli military industries, because of course he already has contacts with them from the other work that his business does. And IMI puts together basically a quick, simple semi-auto version of the Uzi by just taking the fire control group and blocking the selector switch so you can't move it to full auto. Stern submits that to ATF, and ATF promptly kicks it back and probably laughs in his face at the time, and under the premise that this is super easy to convert to a machine gun, so we're not going to give you a permit to import this thing. At that point, Stern has to come up with a more fundamental semi-automatic conversion of the Uzi. And, well, he happens to employ Uzi Gal. So they come to an agreement, and Uzi designs a semi-automatic version of the gun, one that doesn't allow for easy conversion into a machine gun. They come to an agreement. Uzi's going to get a 5% royalty on sales. It seems like it sounds like Stern didn't really think this would be a huge product, but it would be a cool thing to add to, to the company's inventory and catalog. And hey, it'd be fun to get into gun manufacturing. So the gun goes into production. It's introduced at the 1980 SHOT Show and kind of very quickly becomes a really big hit. There's a lot of marketing around it. Peter Kokalis writes a very complimentary review of it for Soldier of Fortune magazine, which is still a thing in 1980. In fact, it's a huge thing in 1980. And the gun really takes off. They get something like orders for 7,000 of them at SHOT Show in 1980, much more than anyone anticipated. Now, these guns aren't actually being manufactured in Philadelphia. They're being manufactured at the main IWI facility in Israel, just like military submachine guns, except they are semi-autos, and then imported through Action Arms into the US, where they then have a big network of distributors and then retailers, the classic sales sort of structure. And in the first 3 years, Action Arms manages to sell 36,000 Uzi Model A semi-automatic carbines. Now, we'll take a look at the internals in a minute, but they've been converted to semi-auto only, and of course they also have 16-inch barrels on them. The standard Uzi submachine gun has a 10-inch barrel, but the longer barrel is required so that these are considered rifles and not short-barreled rifles. They're imported with the standard Uzi folding stock. Contrary to what some people may suspect, this wooden stock has nothing to do with assault weapons legislation in the US. The Uzi was actually sold militarily and adopted militarily with a fixed wooden stock by a bunch of countries. And let's be honest, this wooden stock is a whole lot more comfortable to use than the folding metal stock. The metal stock is compact. The wood stock is really the much nicer one to shoot. So the guns are coming into the US. Things are going really well. They end up making a modification of the gun. They go from the Model A to the Model B in 1983, introducing a couple minor changes. They change the sights, and they also add a firing pin safety. We'll take a look at both of those changes in a moment. They would continue then importing and selling the Uzi Model B until 1989, and they brought in about another 36,000 Uzi Model Bs. So something like 72,000 semi-automatic Uzi carbines over the course of about 9 years. Really, it was a very successful project. They didn't have to tool up and do manufacturing because IMI did that. It was just a great marketing thing. Now, in 1989, a U.S. assault weapons import ban went into effect, and that pretty much squashed Action Arms and the IMI imported Uzis. These could no longer be legally imported into the U.S. Of course, they were just fine if they were here, and guns like this could still be manufactured in the US, but they couldn't be imported. And basically, the whole project fell apart at that point. Action Arms would go on, they still could work with some guns. They had a pistol version of the Uzi that they could still import, but that wasn't a big seller. They went and tried to, they worked with CZ for a little while, but that fell apart. Basically, the story ends in 1989 as far as we're concerned for today. Now, there's one other element to the story that I want to touch on, and that is the relationship between Harry Stern, who owned Action Arms, and Uzi Gal, who, of course, designed the Uzi submachine gun. When he did the design, the semi-automatic design for the gun, Uzi and Stern agreed to a 5% royalty for Uzi on every gun that was sold. Apparently, Stern didn't think there would be a whole lot of these guns and wasn't really concerned about the royalty. Well, when they took off, Stern decided just not to pay Uzi his due royalties, and really apparently totally tried to screw him over. It was not a good thing. Uzi ended up leaving the company. He was unemployed for a year. Eventually, he sued Stern for royalties because he had no income and really needed this money. It went to court. It took 4 years of just nasty, grueling court ick. And ultimately, the judge found Uzi the winner. He was in fact due quite a substantial sum of back royalties. In fact, in addition to that, the judge also tacked on punitive damages against Stern, and the judge took a look at the original royalty agreement and went, 5%. 5% is really substantially below the industry standard. I'm going to make that a 10% royalty that you are owed, plus punitive damages. So Uzi and Stern apparently didn't speak again until 1991, but ultimately Uzi did get what he deserved for the work that he put into these guns. So that turned out all right. Anyway, let's take a closer look at the insides, and I'll show you how this is different than a standard Uzi and what the difference is between the Model A and the Model B. If you can get up close enough to look at the markings on the back of the gun, it's very easy to distinguish between a Model A and a Model B. The Model A is marked Model A. And you might have seen this coming. The Model B is marked Model B. Note that they're all marked Uzi Semiauto, IMI Israel. On the opposite side, they are marked with Action Arms Philadelphia, because Action Arms was the importer. And then they will have a serial number prefix that is SA, followed by the serial number. Marking styles changed slightly here, but all of these guns, the A's and the B's, are in the same serial number range. So our Model A here is actually a pretty early one, 4400. Our Model B is right in the middle of the pack. So there are basically three changes that were made between the A and the B: the rear sight, the front sight, and the firing pin safety. We'll start at the rear sight. The B here has this giant adjustable knob to allow you to adjust windage on the rear sight. The original Model A's have a rear sight that is adjustable in, well, it's not adjustable at all. It has two leaf apertures. There is a 100-yard aperture and a 200-yard aperture. And interesting bit of trivia, these sights were calibrated for the standard 10-inch barrel of the regular submachine gun, and they didn't bother to change that when they put on a 16-inch barrel for the American semi-auto version. So the sights aren't quite regulated perfectly on the Model A's. The Model B would fix that. It adds windage adjustment, and then you still have a 100 and a 200-yard or meter notch, but in this case they are now actually zeroed for the 16-inch barrel. Now the reason that they had to add a windage adjustment to the Model B was that on the Model A, the windage adjustment was actually built into the front sight. As you can see here, this front sight is actually slightly eccentric. So on both of these, you adjust elevation by screwing the sight up or down. And in this case, what you would do is set it to approximately the correct number of turns for your elevation, and then you would adjust it slightly by rotating it through this 180-degree arc, which causes the front sight post to travel left to right, right to left. So you're zeroing windage and elevation at the same time using the front sight. On the Model B, they actually started using an elevation adjustable only front sight of the same type that they were using in the Mini Uzi, which was the pistol version of the gun. So I believe that this was probably done because it's a simpler part and to standardize with the other versions that were coming into the country. However, if you lose the ability to adjust windage on the front, you have to add it to the rear, which is what they did. Now, I did say that there were only three differences. I kind of lied. There is one other small difference. On the Model A, the front sling swivel rotates 90 degrees. On the Model B, it rotates 360. It's not exactly a life-changing issue there. So the sights and the sling swivel are one thing, but there was one actual really substantive change to the design that was introduced with the Model B, and that was the addition of a firing pin safety. This really does make a difference because, as Uzi pointed out in a warning to, I believe, their distributors in 1980, it was possible for the Model A to fire out a battery. So I'll show you that. In order to take this apart, by the way, we have a little spring-loaded catch here. Once that's out, you can take off the top cover, and then the bolt assembly just pops out of the gun like that, and presto. If you take this pin out, the whole grip frame assembly comes off, and we can also take off the barrel. But what we're interested in is the bolt assembly today. So Uzi's semi-auto only conversion of, well, the Uzi is, I think, pretty interesting because it forms the model for the same mechanism would be used by a whole lot of subsequent designers who are trying to come up with ways to convert open bolt full auto guns into closed bolt semi-auto ones. So normally the way the Uzi works is you have one recoil spring and there's a sear right up here. In fact, you can see it right here on both sides of the bolt. And when I pull the trigger, that sear is going to drop down. When that drops down, it releases the bolt to travel forward and fire on the full auto gun. What Uzi did was to take that element of the bolt and separate it into a second piece right here. This has the firing pin and it has the sear surface. So the bolt is now no longer catching on this sear. So the bolt's going to go all the way forward, it's going to chamber a cartridge, and it's going to leave the firing pin retracted back something like this. Then when you pull the trigger, instead of the sear releasing the whole bolt, the sear only releases this firing pin piece, which then goes forward, protrudes out the front of the bolt, and fires. That's why there are now two springs back here. You have to have one to push the bolt, and a second one to push what is now basically a striker. As I said, this would be the basis for a whole lot of other semi-auto machine gun conversions. There is one potential safety problem with this setup as it's implemented right here, and that is that there's nothing to stop the firing pin from going forward if the bolt's not in battery. And for that reason, we get the Uzi Model B. The Model B bolt is basically identical. It's certainly the exact same concept. However, there's this little lever that has been added. That lever extends back behind the body of the bolt. And so in this configuration, with the lever sitting like that, the firing pin cannot go far enough forward to actually protrude out the face of the bolt and fire a cartridge. In order for it to fire, something has to push that lever down, which then allows the firing pin to close. In a rather clever design setup, what IMI decided to do, or Uzi, I'm actually not sure if Uzi was the one who designed this improvement or if it was someone else at IMI. They took an existing protrusion in the receiver, namely the ejector. If we look inside the receiver, we can see a fixed ejector right here. That's traveling in this slot in the bolt all the time anyway, and so it's a nice available piece of material there that if you position pieces right, which they did with the Model B, the only time the ejector is going to push that lever up is when the bolt's all the way forward, the cartridge is all the way in the chamber, and it's safe to shoot. So that little added lever provides a really nice extra firing pin safety, basically, to prevent an out-of-battery discharge. The one last really tiny detail change made to the inside of the receiver as part of this process was on the Model B here. You can see that the back surface of the ejector is angled slightly, where on the Model A, up here, the back end is basically square. And the reason for that was to give it a nice smooth surface for that lever to ride up onto for disengagement. There's a belief among a lot of people that the Model A was deemed too easy to convert into a machine gun, and thus the Model B had to be introduced to change that. That is actually really not at all the case. The Model A was approved by ATF as a legitimate semi-automatic firearm. It is not interchangeable with full auto internal components, and they were quite happy with that decision after it was approved. So the Model B improves the safety of the gun, but doesn't have anything to do with its status as being convertible into a machine gun. I just realized I never did get back to the Secret Service. So the Secret Service actually proved to be a major marketing tool for Action Arms with the Uzi, not through their own intentions, but the Secret Service had adopted the Uzi in '68, and they were using it for the Presidential Guard detail. In fact, a bunch of other elements of the U.S. Government did use the Uzi for various security services. At any rate, in 1981, there was an assassination attempt on President Reagan, and there were a couple extremely distinctive, popular, and well-publicized pictures taken of one of the president's guards, Secret Service bodyguards, pulling an Uzi submachine gun out, extending the stock, and basically looking for a further threat that he might have to shoot with it. That contributed substantially to the popularity of the Uzi in the American market. All of a sudden, it went from being kind of an unknown gun to now being very directly in the public spotlight. Those pictures of the the Secret Service man are quite iconic. And so that was timed really kind of just perfectly to coincide with Action Arms bringing the semi-automatic gun to market. They'd introduced it in 1980. Here in 1981, this assassination attempt brings the gun really into the public eye in the hands of the security services, the U.S. government. Now, the 1989 import ban is certainly not the end of the story of the semi-automatic Uzi in the United States, because even after that ban, it was still totally legal to assemble guns like this in the U.S., to build them in the U.S., and there are a series of companies that would do just that. There's also there are several stories worth of video about the full auto versions of the Uzi in the U.S., various companies registering guns as dealer samples and producing American-made Uzis, both semi and full auto, and those are all beyond the scope of today's video. But I wanted to show you guys the Action Arms guns because they are legitimate Israeli-produced factory Uzis in semi-automatic only. And as such, they are kind of the Cadillac standard for semi-auto Uzis. The other American-made ones, the Norinco-made copies, the others that would come later are not generally considered as good as Action Arms because they're original Israeli guns. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you didn't find it too excruciatingly boring to take a look at this semi-auto version of what really legitimately is designed as a submachine gun and is really at its best as a full-auto submachine gun. The semi-automatic copy is of questionable value. However, here in the US, this is what is far more available to the average non-machine gun dealer. So if you would like any of these three, take a look at the description text below the video. You'll find links there to Rock Island's catalog pages for all three of these. If you're interested in an Uzi, but you don't want one of these three, there are a couple others in this auction as well. A little bit of searching will find those for you. And if you're interested in any of them, you can place bids right through Rock Island's website, over the phone, or by showing up and participating live in the auction. Thanks for watching.